From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Brad Turner, in today for Erin O'Toole. A proposal to use federal land as a remedy for housing shortages in towns across the West. You may remember that a few weeks ago, Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah wanted to sell off thousands of government-owned acres in western states, including some parts of Colorado. That plan died when some key Republican senators refused to support it. But a similar and more focused proposal may still move forward under the Trump administration. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum has said, why not develop federal land near western communities that are facing housing shortages? And Department of Interior officials will be meeting with local leaders about this in the months ahead. So, how will this idea be received in places like Summit County, which face severe housing shortages, but are also defined by the forests that surround them? Rachel Cohen is a reporter for the Mountain West News Bureau, which KUNC is part of. Rachel's been reporting on this issue and how it might raise some difficult choices for towns in Colorado and around the West. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Rachel, we mentioned Doug Burgum, the Secretary of the Interior, wants to use federal land near towns and turn it into space for housing. We've seen some mountain resort towns face a huge housing shortage in the past 5 years, but can you give us an idea of how widespread these shortages are across the West?
Housing is a challenge pretty much everywhere. You look in the West, whether it's those resort communities or just cities that are now among some of the fastest growing in the country. A Colorado College survey earlier this year found about 80% of Western residents are concerned about the rising cost of living in their area. Wow. Colorado and some neighboring states are among those that have some of the lowest supply of affordable rental housing, and that's for households that are in the lowest income brackets. So Secretary of the Interior Doug Burgum is really touching on an issue that's top of mind for Western communities here.
Why does the Department of the Interior, which I think most people associate with national parks, have an interest in housing in rural towns?
Well, the federal government manages about half the land in the western states, and in some states it's even more. And it's not just national parks, it's also Bureau of Land Management land that's used for grazing or energy. And in some cases in the West, the lack of land that can be developed is one barrier to building housing quickly. And then the other component to this is that there's a precedent. The Bureau of Land Management is allowed to sell certain federal parcels through existing laws. One of those existing programs is specific to the Las Vegas area. It's kind of seen as a model that maybe could be applied to other Western cities experiencing growth. Even the Biden administration had directed agencies to look at whether they had any land that could be better purposed as housing. And so this idea didn't come out of nowhere.
Let's talk about why some leaders in Western towns might find this plan appealing. In your reporting, you spoke to a leader in Summit County, Colorado, which has been working to lease some federal land that was mostly vacant. What had that land been used for, and what does Summit County want to do with that land moving forward?
So Summit County is the first community to lease Forest Service land for the purpose of building affordable housing. And the site that they are leasing, it's an 11-acre, what's known as an administrative site. So it used to have sheds on it and some garages where some tools were kept for the Forest Service workers. And there was some housing on it too. It's perched right above town, right above the Dillon Reservoir. And the plan is to build more than 160 affordable units there for local workers, but also some Forest Service employees. And there are actually some other communities that are trying to do the same things, and one of them is Steamboat Springs. So we might be seeing even more of this, but the construction of the actual affordable housing units hasn't started.
Rachel, there must be a real tension for a leader in Summit County because the national forests in that area are what make it such a beautiful place. But we've talked on this show about workers in Summit County sleeping in their cars and living night to night in hotels because there's no other housing. So those 160 units are very sorely needed. What did the leader you spoke with in Summit County have to say about this sort of preservation versus affordable housing tension?
I think the severity of the housing crisis is certainly why the county was looking at this property as an option to build more housing. It's also one of the last lots that the county could build on that hasn't been developed. And that's, as opposed to building up or building more densely. And I think that those trade-offs that you mentioned are real. These areas, whether it's the forest or the ski resorts, it's why people live in Summit County or why tourists come to visit. But I think it's also why the county commissioner I talked to, Tamara Pogue, is in favor of this specific solution, but was opposed or at least had serious concerns with Senator Lee's proposal. And that's because all along, this idea was really specific to this 11-acre administrative site that was right near town. She mentioned this is not a trailhead. This is not the wilderness. And if we were talking about that, it would be a different conversation.
The conversation around this plan is going to ramp up later this year. Department of the Interior officials say they want to meet with town leaders and have even asked town leaders to let them know if there are properties in their area that they'd like to develop. How do you think local leaders are going to weigh these questions?
Yeah, I think that balance is probably going to vary quite a bit, community to community. But I think it's also important to note that we don't know exactly how this process is going to play out or what role county commissioners, for example, might have in determining what land is used for this purpose.
Looking around the West, Colorado has historically had a conservationist streak, even in the more conservative areas of the state. How do you see this proposal playing out in the more solidly Republican states like Idaho or Utah?
I think on one hand, we could find more pockets of support in more conservative areas. For example, the state of Utah brought forward a lawsuit with the Supreme Court to essentially say that the state would be a better steward of much of the federal land within its boundaries. And there were some local communities that supported that effort that I think could get behind this one too. On the other hand, I think the opposition to Senator Lee's proposal showed that support for public lands is really widespread and bipartisan. It doesn't fit in these neat political buckets. So it could come down to each community and what the support or opposition for development on specific parcels of land looks like.
Rachel Cohen, KUNC's reporter for the Mountain West News Bureau. Thank you for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me, Brad.
Find more of Rachel's coverage and news about public lands in the West at KUNC.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Brad Turner. Have a happy 4th.